that when I started writing about school boards over a decade ago, nobody was interested in them. Really focus on education reform had been moving towards the national level, looking at what No Child Left Behind and the federal government were doing to shape education. But as you mentioned recently, we were very surprised to see a number of small districts in Michigan, places that don't normally get national attention, really became flashpoints over the summer as people turned out in very large number for school board meetings to discuss these issues. And unfortunately, what's happened in several places is the misinformation can be very high, feelings can run very strongly, and unfortunately, sometimes these meetings have had to be shut down simply because they became so out of control. This is not everywhere, but certainly this conversation around critical race theory, CRT, what are we teaching our students, has really brought to the forefront the concerns that local citizens have about what's being taught to their children, how is it being taught, and who's going to be responsible for these issues.
Good evening to all of you. Thank you for coming virtually via Zoom to our program this evening. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Jonathan Saman Hot Buttons Cool Conversations series. I'm Mark Sokol. I'm the president and CEO of JCC Greater Boston. This series is now in its 10th season. Distinguished public figures have been, over the course of this last 10 years, more than 30 programs engaging in conversation on controversial issues of concern not only to the Jewish community, but well beyond. Just a few brief words of introduction. From book bannings to the teaching of critical race theory, educators and parents across the country are clashing over what can and cannot be taught in the classroom. Teachers, librarians, school administrators are caught in the middle of some of the biggest flashpoints in this country's culture wars. This evening, we examine the role of school boards and some state laws that are fueling these latest culture wars. I am really excited, really thrilled to introduce our distinguished panel this evening for tonight's program. First, let me introduce Adam Harris. Adam is a staff writer at The Atlantic, author of the book The State Must Provide. Adam has covered education and national politics at The Atlantic since 2018, and his book, The State Must Provide, is a narrative history of racial inequality in higher education. He is working on his second book currently, entitled Is This America? A History of the South's Role in Politics and How That Region Shapes Us as a Nation. Adam, welcome and thank you for being with us. Second, I want to introduce you to Rebecca Jacobsen. Rebecca is a professor of education policy at Michigan State University. Rebecca's background is in politics and education, where she has focused on public opinion and its impact on education policy. She's written about the politics of charter schools and the achievement gap. Rebecca, a real pleasure to have you with us tonight. Thank you. And finally, let me introduce you to Nicholas Tampio, a professor of political science at Fordham University, right across the street from the Botanical Gardens, as we learned earlier. Nicholas teaches courses in political theory and education policy at Fordham. In addition to his scholarly work, he writes for outlets including the Boston Globe, USA Today, and the Washington Post. Let me introduce all of you to our moderator for tonight's program. His name is Tom Edsall. Tom is a professor of political journalism at Columbia University and an opinion writer at the New York Times. He joined Columbia after a 25-year career at the Washington Post. He's the author of 5 books, including a Pulitzer finalist entitled Chain Reaction: The Impact of Race, Rights, and Taxes on American Politics. Just a few more housekeeping details that are important. As we begin our program, we'd like to thank our splendid, dedicated, and loyal donors. Without your financial support, we would not be able to produce this program this evening or any of the programs we've brought you over the past decade. We appreciate your commitment to fulfilling the mission of both the Jonathan Saman Hot Buttons School Conversations series and our Jewish Community Center. And finally, our panel will be taking questions from our audience members towards the end of the program. Without any further ado, Tom, it is now my pleasure to turn things over to you, our moderator for tonight's program.
Mark, thank you very much. That was a very nice introduction for all of us. I want to commend the people who organized this program for their prescience in picking this subject, school boards, months ago. It has become clear that school boards are a central battleground in contemporary politics, much more. They have always been, in my opinion, but in this case, the focus has really been on them, especially since the election in Virginia, where critical race theory apparently became a substantial issue, whether it deserved to or not. School boards are where the fights over who gets what really, what children get what, become apparent and are right on the surface. Parents will battle for their children, and it brings out both the best and the worst in parental feelings. So this is a subject that is a crucial one at this juncture, and if anything, there is now evidence that battles for seats on school boards have now become part of the whole polarized contest that's affected national and state level politics, is now basically infecting the whole process of who's going to oversee the administration of schools in local districts. Without further going on this, let me ask Rebecca to start with, who has worked a lot on these subjects in Michigan. What it's like on the ground? What's it like at school board meetings in Michigan, which is in itself a battleground state in a large sense, and is now faces some very tough statewide elections, but also, I imagine, some real school board fights. Rebecca?
Yeah, Tom, thanks so much for the question. And thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to talk about this topic because I often tell the students that I teach that when I started writing about school boards over a decade ago, nobody was interested in them. Really focus on education reform had been moving towards the national level, looking at what No Child Left Behind and the federal government were doing to shape education. But as you mentioned recently, we were very surprised to see a number of small districts in Michigan, places that don't normally get national attention, really became flashpoints over the summer as people turned out in very large number for school board meetings to discuss these issues. And unfortunately, what's happened in several places is the misinformation can be very high, feelings can run very strongly, and unfortunately, sometimes these meetings have had to be shut down simply because they became so out of control. This is not everywhere, but certainly this conversation around critical race theory, CRT, what are we teaching our students, has really brought to the forefront the concerns that local citizens have about what's being taught to their children, how is it being taught, and who's going to be responsible for these issues.
Is there any evidence that that parents raising questions about critical race theory have grounds for their concerns, or is this really a created issue?
So I think it's important that we always respect parents' opinions. And I think schools and teachers and school principals will always say that they welcome parent input. Really, it's always been a partnership. I think, though, like you said, no school was teaching critical race theory. Critical race theory grows out of the legal discipline, really thinks about institutional racism, the way that because of our history, it has become woven into some of the institutions in ways that are less visible than the types of racism that we sometimes imagine used to happen in the past, or we think only happened in the past. So it really was a course that would be taught at graduate school. This isn't something that we would be teaching to children. There's no curriculum. CRT is not a curriculum. So in many ways, this concern about CRT specifically is manufactured.
Adam, you've been covering this, roaming around the country, I gather. What's your take on this fight? What's going on, and what's really underpinning these conflicts?
Yeah, and I think a lot of the points that Rebecca made were spot on, right? Where you go to some of these school board meetings now, and sometimes they do kind of go off the rails in ways that we are not typically used to seeing. And even if there's normal order of business, that first, if you have a 2-hour or 3-hour school board meeting, the first hour is probably going to be about some of the things that the students were doing in class or going over budgets and typical school business. But then you move into this sort of last part of the school board meeting where you have the public comment, and that's where you really start to see some of the vitriol coming out. And it's interesting the ways that just the national conversation is really influencing this inherently local thing. And just to add on to the point about kind of the current ire over critical race theory, or what has been described as critical race theory, is typically when I go to these meetings, I'll ask parents who may be protesting critical race theory, say, okay, well, what is critical race theory? And they struggle with the definition of it, especially the definition that was the traditional definition of critical race theory, and say that it's teaching my kids to hate themselves or what what may have you. And so there's this interesting way. I mean, of course, as we all know, kind of school boards have historically been these sort of flashpoints for, these broader national conversations. But the way that it's coming out and the frequency that it is kind of surfacing in this moment feels unique.
Do the parents making these complaints, basically the white parents, do they have a case at all, or do you think they've really been pulled into a debate by under false flag cover kind of? Is there any legitimacy to their concern that their kids are being taught that they're to blame for racism and so forth, or is this, what's your bottom line on this?
Yeah, it's largely, I think the bottom line is effectively that critical race theory, as it is practiced in law schools and graduate programs, is a way to understand how law and racism in American law intersect, the ways that it has sort of infused these institutions. At a K through 12 level, what is actually being protested is not critical race theory. It is often kind of just generally teachings of American history. There are laws in different states that have moved to ban several books that aren't necessarily critical race theory, aren't necessarily even critical theory or American history. It's just kind of books about culture. I remember talking to one parent just from over here in the Loudoun County School District, and I asked him, can you define critical race theory? And he was like, well, it's this thing that's teaching my kid to hate themselves. And then I asked, well, that's not exactly what it is, historian. And he's like, well, some of the stuff my kids are learning is borderline pornographic, right? And it's like, well, that was a jump. And then you sort of move from there into, we had a conversation about LGBTQ characters in books in school in the 8th and 9th grade. And so it was sort of an amalgamation of all of these different cultural issues that were being tied into this one veil of critical race theory. And so the bottom line is that the sort of CRT that we're talking about in the national discussion is sort of this manufactured amalgam of all of these cultural issues that has taken on this banner of CRT.
But the CRT has in effect become kind of a magnet for all the from transgender bathrooms to the teaching of mommy, the kid has two mummies or two daddies, and all these collective issues have now somehow honed in on CRT, and so it's become emblematic of a whole set of basically culture war issues. Nicholas, what's your how do you see this?
Great, thanks for asking. So the way you frame the question of polarization as a problem, I don't necessarily think polarization is a problem. Going back to Machiavelli, he said part of what kept Rome free was these tumults between people who are fighting about freedom. And so for me, I think it's great that people are coming to school boards and arguing and yelling and presenting their cases. Sometimes I'll agree with the people who are yelling. Sometimes I'll disagree with them. But, you know, just at this level of discussion, I want people going to school board meetings and raising their concerns and having these debates within them. I think that's the lifeblood of democracy, people arguing and talking with one another. Now, I don't want to defend everything that parents say. I'm sure you can find examples that would say, well, no, that's beyond the pale. I wouldn't say that. That's gone too far. But I do think that parents who are raising concerns about CRT, I mean, we can either try to play a gotcha game where we say, all right, you know, list 5 CRT articles in law review journals, and if you can't, you don't know what you're talking about. Or you can try to listen with an open heart and say, well, what are they concerned about? And Yasha Mounk wrote an article in The Atlantic that is basically, I'm restating his argument, which is that there is a certain narrative about race that certain people from different races object to, right? That to say that it's sort of essential, it's baked into our DNA. And I think that a lot of people feel that denies the promise that things can get better. And so the term that people are using right now is CRT. I wouldn't use the term. I think racial essentialism is the issue that actually really bothers people. But you know, for me, if people want to debate these issues, I think that's totally fine.
Can you explain a little more what you mean by racial whatever it was? Essentialism.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think.
Go ahead.
I mean, I think from the 1619 project, you know, this summer I'm writing a book about teaching political theory, and I read the 1619 project, and I read a couple articles by Kimberly Crenshaw, and I think the claim that bothers people is the thing that slavery is America's original sin, as if, you know, and how do you get rid of original sin? I mean, can we do it with our own efforts? Do we need God to heal our original sin? Or the notion from the 1619 project that it's part of our DNA, or the notion that, you know, it's just sort of intrinsic to American identity. I think a lot of people find that objectionable, and I think they should be allowed to say their piece.
Rebecca, what do you say to that argument, and what are school board members saying to that argument?
Sure. So one of the things that I think is important to this discussion is that we have had local school boards for a very long time where people have come and disagreed. And I completely agree with Nicholas that this has been a really important space for civic and political engagement. School boards can often be an opportunity to engage and become a sort of somebody that's more involved in your community. Many school board members state that they ran for school board because they really want to give back to their community. I think what's different about what's going on right now is that there's really a concerted effort by national actors, and not just national actors on the right regarding CRT. We've had involvement of national actors on the left for particular school reform agenda issues as well. And that's what's really different now, is that it's really, these issues are being seeded not from the grassroots sort of ground up, but these issues are being seeded by a national agenda and narrative that's being pushed down to local citizens. And so I think that what we see across many of these school boards, and even across the states that have introduced legislation to ban CRT, is identical language. I've been struck by the number of parents who use the identical language in vastly different locations to be concerned about their local schools, and yet their complaints are identical. And that's what concerns me about these efforts now, is that they aren't that wonderful democratic opportunity for disagreement if they're being seeded by these national interests. They're not truly local concerns.
Is there, do you think, such a thing as teaching racial essentialism taking place?
I think that there have been efforts. I'm in a college of education, and I think that there have been increasing efforts, especially in response to national events, to try to raise awareness of inequality in our society, specifically racial inequality, and the ways that particularly African Americans historically and currently continue to have different opportunities and live a very different life than many white Americans even imagine they live. And so I think that there have been efforts to do that in the College of Ed. There have been efforts to train teachers to become more responsive to a wider range of students as our student demographics shift around the country. But I can't speak about all schools, but I certainly don't think there's an effort to teach racial essentialism.
Adam, how do you respond to what Nick was saying about teaching racial essentialism?
I would agree with Rebecca there, where, you know, when I think of racial essentialism, I think of something that's you know, the sort of inherent biological genetic experiences or things that define an entire race, right? And so in the context of what people are arguing against teaching at this moment, it's a lot of it kind of boils down to various pieces of history, right? And so and mine did, right? I've talked to dozens upon dozens of parents who have been at these protests and been protesting a lot of these things, and a lot of the arguments that you hear, and I've you know, tried to listen with a compassionate ear and try to understand the experiences, right? As a parent who, you know, has been dealing with online education, as well as, you know, kids getting sent home for the last 2 years, I understand a lot of the frustration. If you think about where kind of over the last 2 years, where this sort of frustration has grown from, it started with people upset that schools were closed. And it moves into, okay, now I've seen some of the stuff that people are saying is happening in other schools, and now I see what they're saying in my kids' classroom. I'm see we're all at home together as they're doing their online education. I don't necessarily like what's happening there. But then, as Rebecca was saying, it's sort of, there's this sort of national conversation being mapped onto the local conversation, and the talking points that when you ask the parents and you really kind of dig in, it turns into, this is a thing that happened in Arizona, this is a thing that happened in Milwaukee, this is a thing that's happening in Durham, North Carolina, and now I want to ban this in my kid's school district when I don't have necessarily a working definition of what I want banned.
One of the things that happens in schools, it happens in a lot of places, but schools in particular, is that some of these competitions are zero-sum competitions, or they're seen that way. That, for example, one of the issues in New York and in a lot of other places are entry into the sort of top high-skill schools, high schools, and sort of merit-based entry. And there's among Black and Hispanic parents, there's a concern that they're being excluded from the opportunities that these schools offer, while Asian Americans and white Americans argue that if you lower the standards, they will lose their spots in this, and that their kids have deserved those spots. Nick, how do you think these things get resolved?
Yeah, well, I live in the suburbs, so I teach in Fordham in New York City, and I live in the suburbs, and I'm not sort of immersed in the highly selective schools of New York. But I mean, I really think that there's just so much homogenizing and standardizing pressure in New York City and elsewhere, and you know, I mean, I think it's a really tough nut to crack, because if you just do it by test scores, you're going to get one kind of demographic that's not going to represent lots of other kinds of students in the city. So I try to be consistent in my positions. I'm a huge critic of standardized testing. I think it just narrows the curriculum. It incentivizes people to learn a very narrow set of skills. I think one of the ideas of Mayor de Blasio, or outgoing Mayor de Blasio, was to have the top percentage of New York's top percentage in a student class go to one of the selective schools and high schools in New York City. I mean, from afar, my view is, why can't we just make lots of good schools in New York City? Why do we have to have Stuyvesant and Bronx Science and just a handful of these other schools, siphoning off, if not the smartest, at least the most ambitious kids, or the kids from the most ambitious families? I want good local schools. That's what I'm arguing for. I want to empower parents and families to make good local schools. And, I'm going to try to push back against anything that stops that from happening.
Rebecca, what are there other zero-sum issues that come up like that? That was one group seems to think that if they gain, the other loses, or if the other group gains, they lose. Is this a pretty commonplace kind of problem, and does it come up in other areas?
Well, I think part of why we've gotten into this situation somewhat is because we have increasingly been talking about the purpose of education as being economic prosperity. So we tell kids today, the reason why you go to school is so that you can work hard and get a good job and make a lot of money. That's not why we set up public schools. That's not why we set up local school boards. That was a piece of what we wanted schools to do, but it was never really intended that schooling would be just for individual goals. We really saw public schools in this country originally as being for a public good, where we would teach not just academic, standardized test curriculum material, but we would teach a wide range of things. And increasingly, we have told people the way to succeed or the way to secure a middle-class future is to go to school. And so then it does feel like a zero-sum game, because you're competing for every little credential possible to get to the next level of schooling. And so part of what I hope we can do with some of these conversations, if we can sort of lower the volume on them, is get back to the point where we actually do talk about what do we want for our schools, not just what do I want for my child in school.
Nick, did you just raise your hand?
Yeah, if I may jump in real quick. I mean, one of the conversations parts has been about the Virginia governor's race, and I think Youngkin presented himself as the candidate for families, and he just appointed as the Secretary of Education the woman who founded the Data Quality Campaign, which is totally in line with what Rebecca was just saying about collecting data on students to steer them onto career paths. So there's so many issues that are interconnected, but I mean, I agree with her entirely that we need to have these conversations about how do we bring back education to raising citizens, raising thoughtful people, raising good community members, and not just fuel for the economy.
Adam?
Yeah, I agree with both what they're saying, and there was it made me think of, so there's this sort of like trickle down happening, right? Where it comes from, you think about the change and shift in how we've perceived higher education and what the purpose of higher education is, from a public good where, George Washington in his first address before Congress is effectively saying there's nothing that can better deserve your patronage, your dollars, than higher education, because that is the place where we build good citizens. And so literally from the beginning of the Republic, when they were thinking about creating a national university to build good citizens and to build citizens, that idea of education as a public good has been there. But then once you have this sort of shift to viewing higher education as a private good around the 1950s, 1960s, kind of as you also have integration, right? There's that shift. And so it's if they get in, right, then we are going to be losing out on something, as opposed to we should have a robust, well-funded education system that works for everyone.
I think one of the problems, that's fine in theory, but one of the problems is that the economy now has increasingly rewarded higher education with higher pay. The separation from a high school graduate's pay and a college graduate's pay has gotten wider and wider. So there is a real economic difference that was not there before. And that has, in effect, created one huge zero-sum tension between those kids that get to go to college and those kids that don't. and especially in school policies that might encourage one group more than another group to go through an education process that will lead to college. So there are sort of real pushes and pulls here that are very hard to deal with. One question I was wondering, Rebecca, how destructive do you think these fights are that are taking place now? How much can be lost? Nick has argued that it's beneficial to have these fights to get it all out in the open. Is there are there real costs that can be resulted from these battles?
Yeah, I think there are some very real costs, and this is probably what keeps me up at night the most when I think about these conversations. For a long time, we have maybe been willing to criticize those other people's schools, but my school, my local school, was really special, right? I like my local teachers, I like my local school, and there's sort of been this long-standing funny finding is that people will say, well, the nation's schools aren't so good, but everybody says my school is great. We say this about our representatives, we say this about everything. Everybody else's isn't so good, but mine is good. And what I think is worrying me, and something that my research team and I have been looking at in Michigan, was the decline in confidence that we found when we asked people in October and November, sort of at the height of this discussion, was the number of Michiganders, the number of parents who said they didn't trust their local teachers to be teaching their children about race and racism, to be trusting their local teachers to be selecting materials to incorporate into the classroom. And I think when we begin to see that decline in trust, that relationship, I worry that no matter how much Nicholas and I want those great conversations to happen, if you don't trust the people that you're sending your children to every day, it's going to be really hard to have difficult conversations. And we need to have difficult conversations about race in the United States. These are important disagreements we need to have. We need to be able to have different opinions. And I'm just not sure we can do that if we don't trust each other.
You're saying basically it'd be great to have the conversations, but it's awful hard to have those conversations given these tensions. Adam, are you finding that too in your pursuits around the world, around the country?
Yes, it's interesting because I remember going to this one meeting, and going to a lot of these meetings, even before all of this, right, where you can kind of go to a school board meeting, you can talk to a parent, you ask them a question. I remember going to this one meeting where I asked a parent, hi, I'm a reporter with The Atlantic, I just like to ask a couple of questions. And the first thing she said to me was, are you a liberal? I'm a reporter with The Atlantic. Are you a liberal? She asked me multiple times, and it was fascinating. It was a fascinating thing to experience, because it was like, this is a thing that happens at political rallies. This is not a thing that has happened. Well, it had not happened to me to that point outside of political rallies. And so it was interesting that it wasn't necessarily about. It wasn't going to be about the debate or whatever, it wasn't going to be about my questions. It was like, I'm trying to figure out which tribe you are a part of, so that I know how I should behave and respond to you. And that was sort of interesting and instructive in thinking about this broader idea of a reasoned debate at a school board meeting, where perhaps the parents would offer a comment to the board, as opposed to offering comments to the other parents who were seated in the room, which is actually what happened at this meeting that I was attending. And it was just really sort of tribalistic that did not lend itself towards that conducive conversation.
Do you find that the debate that's going on now on all these issues, CRT, transgender, LGBT, everything, that it is more destructive than constructive, or that it is the net result so far, at least, adverse? Is it undermining education, or is it enhancing education?
I think to this point, it's really folks talking across each other, right? And so it's hard to be constructive when you're like people are legitimately just not listening across the barriers. And so I don't know how you mend. Right. If you want everyone to come to the table, but the table's broken, I don't know how you mend that table. But I think that it's necessary before we can move towards those kind of constructive conversations. That table needs to be mended.
Nicholas, what do you think? Is the conversation that you would like to see happening, or is it becoming? Go ahead.
Oh, no, I mean, I definitely think the conversation is pretty acrimonious. I mean, what Rebecca was saying about declining trust sounds right, about Adam saying, what he was saying about what tribe are you on? And so the question is, well, what do you do how do you rebuild trust? And here I would point to a famous book in political science that came from a famous article by Robert Putnam called Bowling Alone. And he was saying that the way to build trust, the way to build social capital is to do things together. And so the title is Bowling, but it's really anything where you're sort of doing things in a collective manner. So, one way to do that is to run schools. And what I would love to see happen is parents welcome to schools, right? My wife used to volunteer in the kindergarten class. Bunch of different parents came in and were volunteering in the kindergarten class. Then the Common Core was rolled out. I made some observations, and then the principal said, "Okay, no more parent volunteers in schools. We got to put out the Common Core debate." And it's like, okay, well, you win that battle, but what's the long-term consequences? So for me, this conversation about CRT and some of the transgender issues, I mean, I want us to think sort of broadly about how are we going to heal these divisions. And I think the thing is, we have to be respectful. We have to do things together. We have to make different parties welcome in schools. And sometimes that means listening to them when they're pretty upset with us. And we can maybe push them out, but then you could just anticipate that the trust in teachers will drop if certain parents don't feel like they're welcome in the schools.
Do you think it's possible to have culturally conservative and racially conservative parents and racially liberal and culturally liberal parents together in the same school?
That's a tough one. And I mean, my vision, if I may, is that I would like to see there are lots of different types of schools in the country. I mean, I've reading this great book by Elizabeth Todd Breland of Political Education. I mean, I feel bad I have the Xerox, but it's about the Black Power movement in Chicago, and they said, we want a say in the curriculum. We want a culturally relevant history. We want a certain number of Black educators. We want certain kind of books in the library. And I say, well, great, and I mean, she's writing this book to defend Black families in Chicago who want to be part of the schools. And so, there's going to be some battles, and there are probably going to be some people moving into moving trucks. But I think I'd rather be okay with that than just sort of this blanket uniformity that's achieved by telling everybody who disagrees to be quiet. That sounds like a nightmare to me. I would rather allow there to be robust debates in schools.
Rebecca, what do you think there is a way to resolve what's the prospect for getting back to sort of a consensual agreement on how we would all like our children to be raised, to be productive, to do the best they can, What's the chances that there can be some kind of agreement on that?
I think there's a lot more agreement than there is disagreement. And so I think that's a really important place to start. When we asked people, before sort of using any of the trigger words today, but just do you support, more general statements, people have a lot of commitment. And I think we can go back to some of those core beliefs and start there rather than using the inflammatory language. But I also think we have to look at, some of this is not an education problem. This is a housing problem. We live in increasingly homogenous communities, increasingly segregated communities, and some of our grading of schools and saying, oh, this school school is a 98 and this school is a 94 has actually fueled more segregation. We see parents that have the means move into whiter and wealthier communities because those have higher test scores. And so we have, unfortunately, I think, are moving in the wrong direction to be able to build trust with people unlike ourselves. The more that we fuel this sort of idea that my kid has to go to the best school is the one with the test scores that is supposedly an A+ rating.
How would you remedy that? By regulation, by changing school boundaries, by having cross-county school districts, for example?
Unfortunately, I think there's very little education remedy left that the Supreme Court, given some of the Supreme Court rulings that are in place. I really think this is a housing issue, and maybe that's for another day. But one thing that we could do in education is we could actually start teaching kids how to think critically. And that comes with having your ideas challenged. That means being able to understand and respect the parts of a different argument that are not what you believe, but you still see the merits in them. And these are things that we could value, but right now, because we value test scores, those things aren't being taught, those things aren't being fostered. And I think, unfortunately, we have a generation of students that haven't been taught how to engage in different kinds of modes of learning and inquiry other than, can I pass a test?
Adam, it's been really almost roughly 70 years since Brown v. Board of Education was decided, and we've been attempting to deal with racial conflict for a long, long time now. Attempting. Is race still driving this whole debate?
I would largely say, if you think about what folks, parents, pundits are saying, right? It starts with, oh, well, this thing that they're teaching is making my kid hate themselves for being white. And it starts with, it's hard to say it's about something other than race when that's the first thing that it goes to, right? Considering the fact that, oftentimes in schools, right, I am, pretty far removed from school, from K through 12, but not super far removed. It's not like we were learning, I wasn't reading Faces at the Bottom of the Well by Derek Bell in the 11th grade, right? I wasn't reading, I wasn't getting critical race there. I was not getting very much Black history at all, right? And there has been this push of late, right, to reassess these sort of narratives that we have constructed, these sort of tidy narratives of racial progress that we have constructed, right? If you think, okay, from you have the Declaration of Independence, you have the Constitution, then we fight a civil war over slavery, and the slaves are freed. Then you have some really bad stuff in Jim Crow, but then you have Martin Luther King, and then he gets his own holiday, and then Barack Obama is elected president. Right? It's a directly linear. And there, of course, you touch on, okay, slavery was bad. Jim Crow was bad, but it doesn't talk about the ways that those legacies remain. Right, the things that are still there from that history, and that's not something that's being taught in K through 12. Like even just that straight history, that straight narrative history is being taught. But when you have this broader national reconsideration of that tidy narrative, because it's not to say that I think that there's this other. I'm sorry, this is sort of rambling, but I promise there's a point at the end. There's another. Sort of thread that runs through all of this that is to say that if you are criticizing something about American history, that means you dislike America, or that means you are somehow not as patriotic if you're criticizing a piece of that history. When really, right, if you are working towards making a union more perfect, then you have to examine the sticky parts, right? The sticky parts are what kind of removing some of that is what makes your paint smooth on the wall, right? If you're gonna spackle a hole in your wall, you have to sand it down and sort of really get into those sticky parts to make things smooth. And I think that is the reassessment that is going on right now. And when you have that sort of reassessment, that can create that conflict. And at the very core of this is the fact that the reassessment is happening and they are being told that it is happening to their children, that their children are, the thing that I am worried about sending my daughter to school every day because I know that, there is a virus and, she's too young to wear a mask and she's also unvaccinated. All of these different things, like you inherently fear for your child. And when you are being told that your child is being taught that they are supposed to hate themselves because of their race, that is something that you are going to fight about. And so I understand that, but I think that we have to be operating with the same facts in order for that debate to be constructive.
Are you saying that some people will hear the same thing and they will have a different interpretation? That a white parent might hear that X is being taught and interpret that in a way that it sounds like their children are being told they are guilty or that they have white privilege, whereas a Black parent or a Black student might hear that as describing history as it has been. And are there two ways of looking at the past and the present that cloud this whole issue?
I think that one of the issues is that some people are being told things that may not actually be true in their district, right? And so it's in some cases, it's people are operating from two different worldviews and two different sets of facts. But in another case, right, if you are told that, if you live in, say, Clinton, Tennessee, and you are told about this event that happened in the 1950s at Clinton High School, where during integration, the Black students had their hair pulled, and one of the students had their heels stepped on until they bled, and they were putting tacks in the seat, and night riders were driving by the students' houses, and then you realize, oh wait, my family lived in Clinton, Tennessee at that time. That may be an uncomfortable thing to hear, right? And so, but also that's not the depth of history that they're often getting in the in K through 8 or even sometimes 9 through 12. So I think at the root of what I'm trying to say is effectively a lot of times people are operating from two different sets of information. You may have a set of, and there's only one set of facts, so only one side of that is going to be operating with that proper set of facts.
Nicholas, what do you say to that, man?
Well, I'm really glad to be on this panel and to be in this discussion with Adam. So maybe I could just pose you a question. Would you want the same history taught in Hawaii, Texas, Maine? And I say, why would you do that? Right? They all have these different places in American history. They all have their particularities of their history. Time is finite. I don't know why you would focus on Mexican relations if you're up in Maine. I don't know why you would talk about Pacific Islands if you were in Texas. Like you need to allow people to have robust debates. And this is the point I'll just make here. Democracy is a way of life. It's not an agreement on a set of facts. Right? And the way that you teach people to be democratic citizens is to give them a little bit of power. Say, you know what, parent, you have a little bit of say in your school. You know what, teacher, you have a little bit of say in your classroom. Governor, president, you got to kind of butt out a little bit. You can't have too much power, right? And so for me, I would say that the challenge is, how do we make democracy a living reality rather than just, agreed set of facts?
But that doesn't address the issue of how do you teach high school and junior high school students the history of the Civil War and slavery leading up to it. And there's some sort of national national
Yeah,
truths.
but I mean, there's lots of different ways to teach things, right? That there's some people will focus on economic factors, some will focus on human beings who led the changes. Some will go way back in time, while some will start more recent. I mean, I'm an academic. We're constantly arguing with one another, right? I mean, if you kind of come in and say like, "Yo, I've got the facts," like, people are gonna just say, "What are you talking about?" Right? Reasonable people disagree. I mean, just if you have 5 minutes, look at John Rawls's Political Liberalism on the Burdens of Judgment. I mean, he just gives you 10 reasons quickly why people are going to disagree about how to interpret something like the Civil War. So if you're asking me, I mean, I want my kids to learn about the Civil War. I want lots of other Americans to learn about the Civil War. But I mean, I trust that there are lots of different ways to approach the subject.
Adam, you want to?
Well, yeah, and I don't disagree. Yeah, I don't disagree that, if you're in Maine, you should have, your course on Maine history. And it shouldn't be, maybe like if you live in Little Rock, Arkansas, I don't expect you to learn about the Clinton 12. If you live in, Texas, right, you can have these, and parents can have their say in it. But I do think that if you are going to have that robust debate, it has to start with, like, there's, of course, history is an evolving thing. As you learn more facts about something that happened in the past, you get a better understanding of what, and people can look at two things and arrive at a different conclusion, but they have to be looking, or, if you look at one thing, you may arrive at different conclusions, but if you have to be looking at the same thing. But if people are looking at two different things and arriving at two different conclusions, and that's effectively what I end up seeing at a lot of these school board meetings, where they're looking at two separate issues, and trying to have a rational conversation. So I agree. I want that democracy to be productive, and I want those robust discussions, as we all should. But you have to be looking at the same thing in order to have that robust discussion.
Rebecca, can you settle this for us?
I don't know that I can settle this, but there was a question from the audience too about this balance between sort of teacher expertise and what should the kids should learn versus what parents want them to learn. And I think this is going to be a perennial debate. There is no perfect solution. We can't resolve it. But I would hope, as somebody who was a classroom teacher for many years, I would hope that we would have some deference for, the expertise that teachers do bring to classrooms. And certainly I hope, and the teachers that I train, I hope I teach them well to welcome questions. But at the end of the day, schooling has to be for everyone, not just for the individual child. And of course, as a parent, I think about my kid, I do this too. But I want us to remember too that we should have some collective understanding as well. And certainly there's lots of space within that. But I hope we have some common grounding that does bring us all together as well.
We should do some questions from the audience who have been very active, and we have not been responsive. I have not been responsive enough to them. Here's someone, William Lafarge writes, whenever one says that one is opposed to CRT being taught in school at any time, I believe that one is opposed to history from a Black man's point of view to be taught in school at any time. Would you agree? Nick?
I would strongly disagree with that. I mean, if there's a great book edited by my friend Melvin Rogers and Jack Turner, it just came out with University of Chicago Press. It's called African American Political Thought. It's an anthology. So I think it's got 30 chapters on 30 African American thinkers. That there are robust debates among African Americans about, is the Constitution a freedom document or a slave document, right? There's huge debates among African Americans about how to look at the Constitution. Do you look to the state for help, or do you go with Frederick Douglass? And he writes his essay at the end of his life called "Self-Made Men," about sort of just get out of the way, state. Let us take over. All we need for you to do is get out of the way. So the fact is that, you know, there are reasonable people, there are reasonable ways, reasonable people disagree about how to understand American history. I mean, I think if you, I mean, maybe Rebecca can jump in and say this, but I think if you ask Republicans, do you think that Americans should learn about the slavery? Well, I think they would say yes. Do you say, should you learn about Civil War? Well, I think yes. Should you learn about Civil Rights Movement? I think they would say yes. They would, but you know, there are these controversial topics that bother people. So you know, there are going to be these debates, but I would try to avoid that sort of I would try to avoid that marginalization of parents who are raising concerns.
Adam, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I don't think that it's necessarily folks being averse to being taught history from a Black person's point of view. I think that there is largely an aversion at this kind of current moment to, I think I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, is there's this cultural moment happening where there is a reassessment of the roots of, and the ways that structural inequality didn't, you know, stay in 1865, that, you know, when the Civil Rights Act was passed in the 1960s, right, that there's still traces of systemic discrimination. I think that broader reassessment and thinking about how situating, you know, people have this tendency to think back to themselves, to situate yourself in that context, rather than, you know, when people are criticizing an institution, it's the institution, not the people that they're criticizing there. So I think that there is a lot of pushback there, but it's also that, like I said, the sort of mapping on of the national conversation onto the local issues. That is often what I see at school board meetings, where, you know, you can, if you watch a Tucker Carlson program, for example, you may hear parents at school board meetings, and I often do hear them saying the exact same things and almost the exact same language as you hear on Fox News.
Let me, we're running out of time. Let me pose one last question. Adam may know the answer to this more than the other panelists. Has Young Kin's order in Virginia, what has he prohibited in his order? Are there specific things that ought to be taught that he would not allow?
So I've actually been tracking these the CRT ban legislation across the states, and there's usually a statement of things that you cannot teach children, this, and this. I think the concern is that it's really unclear often exactly what that is. And so I think a lot of teachers are really unclear, well, you know, I can't teach a kid to feel bad. Okay, well, what happens if I, you know, bring up an issue and it does make them feel bad? Or, you know, how do I address these issues in real time when national organizations are setting up like reporting websites where you can go in and report your class or report your teacher. And so I think many teachers are very apprehensive because they want to be responsive to their students. They want to cover history and cover current events and cover things in a thorough manner. But much of the legislation is very squishy, very difficult to define, and oftentimes just really confusing as to what you can't actually do.
I think Rebecca has put her finger on really what the destructive possibilities are in this whole debate, and how the inhibition of critical and open thinking can occur in this whole process. And certainly teachers do not have the money to afford a lawyer to defend themselves once some national group comes in and has a video of them saying something that they might be able to defend, but it's going to cost a fortune in court if it gets there, or before a school board or disciplinary proceeding. All that is really a danger to free speech in a way that a lot of us don't recognize. Unfortunately, I think we're at the end of our questioning, and I think Mark wants to make some concluding remarks, if I'm correct. Mark, do you want to take it over?
I'd be happy to, Tom. Thank you. I'm just kind of sitting here in awe of the learning, the conversation over the past hour. I was thinking of the person, Jonathan Seyman, for whom this series is named. Over a decade ago, John was the chairman of the board of the JCC, and John unfortunately died far too young. And we sat around and said, John was an attorney who had this ability to bring people who had different points of view together, to talk to each of them and to have them talk to each other. And we said, what could be better for a Jewish community center that tries to, as much as possible, take an optimistic view of the future? We're in the business of optimism and hope. But to create a series like this in Jonathan's memory and honor, where we bring different points of view together about really tough subjects, and the goal is not to resolve them, but it's to have the kind of conversation that we had this evening. So Rebecca and Nicholas and Adam, for your contributions in general to your students, to literature, to journalism, and to our program tonight, I have nothing on behalf of the JCC to say but our deepest gratitude for the learning that you offered us and the learning and the work that you continue to do. So thank you. And Tom, for your expert moderation, we may ask you to return and moderate again and again. You've earned a return ticket to the JCC, and we really appreciate the way you approached the evening, got our panelists involved, and did not discourage disagreement, because the nature of the program is to encourage, much like the conversation raised this evening, raised a variety of points of view, because in that I think we all believe that what is at stake is our very democracy in this country. So from all of us at the JCC, and on behalf of our audience and our partners at WGBH, thank you to all of you. Let me just tell everyone that our next program will be on Thursday evening, March 31st, called An Unprecedented Supreme Court. Much happening and coming to the court that will impact the future of our country, and I encourage you all again to tune in. And maybe even one of these days we'll be back in person, running hybrid programs in person and virtually for our devoted audience. So on behalf of all of us at the JCC and our beloved Jonathan Seyman and his family, thank you all for this incredible conversation this evening. Thanks again, and good night to everybody.